Welcome on behalf of the Konfuzius-Institut at the University of Vienna. My name is Patrick Leistet. I'm the director, the Austrian director of the Institute, and it is my great honor and privilege to welcome a good friend of mine, I would say, Harvey Dzodin, who has written a new book. Finally, we have been waiting for it. Dreaming Dragons or Meddlesome Mandarins. And we're very happy and looking forward to the presentation of this book. And we are also looking forward to him selling lots of copies of the book. Unfortunately, I hear he's not getting much in point of royalties, but he's getting much in information out there. So do give it a try. And without more ado, a hearty welcome here at the University of Vienna.
Hello, everybody. For people who I've met before, thank you for coming in. For friends I haven't met yet, I'm very happy that you could come here today. So, in Dreaming Dragons or Meddlesome Mandarins, we go on a journey to uncover China's essence. China's a country that seems to be dominating our news lately, at least when Donald Trump isn't. I'm not asking you to believe me or anyone who talks about China, although we do have sinologists in this room and you can believe them, because actually seeing is believing. And the only way to decide about China is to see for yourself. First, let me run through some facts and figures, some of which you may or may not know. So many people have this impression of China of having always been this abjectly poor country, and that's not really the case. So this is a chart of the percentage of global GDP over time. So historically, China has been a global economic superpower for much of its long history, with the exception of what's called its century of humiliation from about 1850. So you can see that China, in terms of GDP, was really up there for quite a long time, and it had a dip in the 50s. And while we don't carry this out further, it's really its GDP has come back. So another thing that's interesting about China is social development indicators. So China's life expectancy increased, as you can see, from 36 years when the country was established to 78 years in 2024. And the literacy rate rose from 20% to 97.5%. And urbanization, which is continuing apace really, grew from 13% to 67%. It's still a problem of the country in that sense that the countryside has been left behind in some ways, but it's really catching up. So I'd say that the social development indicators are very indicative of what China has accomplished. So part of the reason that it's accomplished so much is that poverty is declining. And in fact, China has lifted almost 800 million people out of extreme poverty, which is a fact that has been never attained by any other country on this planet. And so no matter what you might think of the Chinese system, China has delivered a lot of well-being for its people. And so that's, I think, a very important point. So here's some comparative GDP information. So you can see it's measured in two ways. economists can't even agree on how to measure GDP. So one of the ways you measure it is called nominal. And perhaps a better way is PPP, purchasing power parity. And by PPP, China is ahead of the US. By PPP, the US is ahead of China. But we can say for sure that China and US and EU are three of the most leading economies in our world today. So here's also another interesting chart about how global manufacturing shares compare. And so you can see China in red, and it was way down there, and you could see the EU or Europe in yellow and the US in blue. And you can see this profound difference that has taken place in China. And it's a China that's maybe somewhat economically challenged at the moment, but that continues in its quest for now high quality development, AI and technical and a lot of advances. And so that's very important to know. And so part of the reason for the acceleration in development is that China is investing in R&D, and also that can be measured by the number of patents. And when you compare it to EU and US, you can see the difference in the number of patents that have been issued. And now we can also see, as I think a lot of people know, that China we're from Detroit. And so Detroit used to be known as Motown, the Motor City, no more. So China is the motor country, and so you can see it in the rising number of EV sales. And some people think China are dumping EVs, electric vehicles, on the market. But today I read an interesting article by somebody who's anti-China, who said that now that Canada has made a deal with China, that we should consider, we, the United States, should consider doing the same and lower the tariffs and so on, and because we need EVs, because we need to protect our environment. And the environment is really being challenged in so many ways, and we are not reversing the situation. President Trump isn't helping very much in that regard. And my wife and I started an association called Earth Care Culture Association because we're worried about the environment, and we hope that we can make a difference in this regard. It's really important. And so here you can see China's renewable energy capacity growth, and that's both in terms of solar and wind. So it's a profound investment that China has made in those new renewable energy sources. So recently, China has been described by some leaders in the West as enemy, friend, frenemy, partner, competitor, and threat. So after tonight, it's my expectation that you'll be better able to decide for yourself if China are a bunch of dreaming dragons or meddlesome mandarins. So why dreaming dragons? To many Westerners, dragons conjure up images of terrifying monsters. However, in China and in much of Asia, dragons are entirely different. For millennia, not Melania, for millennia, that's a movie, it's coming soon. For millennia, Chinese dragons have been revered, mythical creatures symbolizing good fortune, prosperity, power, and wisdom. Far from being feared, the dragon has been celebrated as a symbol of fertility, guardian of the people, and emblematic of the emperor. Throughout China's long history, dragons adorned the robes and thrones of emperors and appeared on banners and flags as a sign of legitimacy and of authority. In stores and art, dragons have soared among the clouds, controlled rain and rivers, and embodied justice, kindness, and the promise of abundance in China. To dream of dragons has meant dreaming of greatness, dreaming of hope, dreaming of unity. And so why Meddlesome Mandarins? Where is this? One of you, John Herzog, gave me this Meddlesome Mandarin to put on my keychain. Thank you for that, John. So the title introduces a figure often misunderstood in the West, the Mandarin, which is also the same word in English and German. It often means an out-of-touch bureaucrat or a self-important official, but the original meaning is much richer and much more complex. In imperial China, a mandarin was an official selected through an extraordinarily difficult examination based on Confucian learning, open to all men, regardless of their economic or social status. These mandarins were the core of China's government for millennia, overseeing many aspects of people's life, from birth to death. Mandarins were not passive, paper-shuffling bureaucrats. They were expected to be ethical, to be proactive, and to be wise. So why do I pair them together in the title? Because to understand its soul, we must examine China's dreams and its realities, past, present, and future. Dragons represent China's aspirations and its sense of destiny. Mandarins remind us of the long tradition of learning, debates, and sometimes meddlesome governance that have shaped everyday life in China and globally. 2 centuries ago, Napoleon, who painted that? Does anybody know?
David.
Who? Yeah, Jean-Louis David, right. That you get 10 points. Okay, and so Napoleon is thought to have said that China's a sleeping giant, and so when she awakes, she'll shake the world. For thousands of years, China was one of the most powerful, richest, and actually, in its times, most technologically advanced countries on the planet, until it wasn't, starting with the Opium Wars and its century of humiliation from the mid-19th century until New China was founded in 1949, and when it again began its return to the world stage, especially taking off on its steep ascent from the late 1980s. But now that China has very much awakened, it's indeed shaking things up so much that modern-day Napoleons are actually divided about whether China is the proverbial bull in the china shop or a responsible stakeholder in our stressed-out and ever-changing, globalized, interconnected, yet fragile planet. 3 centuries ago, before Napoleon, in 1516, lawyer Thomas More wrote his book, Utopia. The word utopia refers to a fictional society where everything is perfect, everything is harmonious, including government, laws, and social conditions. Utopia, from the Greek, though, literally means nowhere. And so it's probably well named, reflecting that such a perfect society didn't and doesn't and probably never will exist. The well-respected More was knighted in 1521 by what king?
Henry VIII.
Right, another 10 points. Okay. But he certainly didn't live in a utopia given his fate. He became Lord Chancellor to King Henry VIII, and he was later beheaded by him. So please know that my conclusion about China, and this really is the essence of the book, is that China and every other country, that utopia doesn't exist. But it only can be found in our dreams. All countries are a mixture of good, bad, and ugly in constantly changing proportions. And know that every country invariably makes mistakes and missteps, since governing has never been easy and can never be 100% perfect. That said, China has made remarkable progress for its people, especially in this century, lifting 800 million people out of extreme poverty. And my wife told me not to say this, but I'm going to say it. Sorry, dear. So I think I'd like to know something, and that's maybe something we can discuss later. And that's why China's awakening and the world shaking has produced so much angst and anger, especially here in the West. It's an important question, especially for those of you who are students, and we're all students. Is it because of specific Chinese policies like human rights or trade or COVID with which people might disagree? Is it because of the rebirth of a long-standing fear by white people of a yellow peril or some great replacement by them and or people of color? Is it just plain racism? Is it the fear of perhaps having peaked economically, politically, or technologically by a system called communist? I hope we have a chance to talk about that. I think it's very interesting. So when I was growing up in Detroit in the 50s and 60s, we were taught that China was an impoverished country where millions of people were dying. We never were taught that China preceded ancient Greece and Rome by thousands of years, that over 9,000 years ago, China was an organized society that was engaged in agricultural pursuits, that its written history dates back at least 3,500 years, that dynastic China began roughly 4 millennia ago and had 559 emperors over, I'm not going to ask you, Jeff, 83 dynasties. You wouldn't have known that, would you?
No.
Okay, all right. So we weren't taught about how high-tech ancient China was. For example, the compass, dating back to the 4th century BCE in China. By contrast, it eventually appeared in Europe. Anybody want to take a guess when it appeared?
12th century. 14th century?
Oh, it's pretty good. Yeah, okay. 1,600 years later. All right. How about paper making, invented in China in the 2nd century CE, but which came here 900 years later? Gunpowder, invented in China in the 9th century, coming to Europe 4 centuries later. And movable type, invented in China in the 11th century. But who got the credit for it?
Gutenberg.
Yeah, Gutenberg, right, exactly. And so he didn't do that until 4 centuries later after China. But for me, the 5th wonder of ancient China was the introduction of paper money more than 1,000 years ago. Think about it. Before this time in China, metal coins had been in use and were seen as having some intrinsic value. But the downside was that they were really heavy. Paper money invented during the Song Dynasty, which lasted from the 10th to the 13th centuries, was lightweight, easy to produce, and had some security features to prevent counterfeiting. Of course, the security features could be defeated, but the death penalty for counterfeiters deterred many of them. When I was a young boy in Detroit, I'd often go to a money museum downtown. The National Bank of Detroit, there was a money museum, Stefan, and I used to spend a lot of weekends there looking at money from all over the world. It was really impossible for the young me to understand how, like a magic trick, that China could turn worthless paper into something of far greater value, especially 1,000 years ago. This was even better than medieval alchemists in Europe, who, try as they did, could never turn base metals into gold. Only later did I learn that the government guaranteed value in a variety of ways, such as controlling the money supply, holding other assets such as gold that gave faith in them to the user. So today, as in the Song Dynasty and after, it's still a universal truth that if and only if government has the trust of the people, can this system function and can it endure? Given this revolutionary economic development paralleling China's other advancements from this dynasty. And for the next 500 years, China's economy remained extremely productive, not until almost a half millennium, sorry, I don't want to use that word because it reminds me of millennia. Yeah, until 500 years later, did Europe begin to develop economically. I know she's from Slovenia, it's nothing personal, nothing about Slovenians. Okay, we love Slovenians. and the 6th century, sixth wonder using the compass and the technology of watertight compartments were the gigantic treasure ships of the Muslim admiral Zheng He during the Ming Dynasty. These compartments did not appear in Europe until the late 18th century. And so this is a comparison of one of Zheng He's treasure ships to one of Christopher Columbus's ships. And I think you can see that it's quite a difference. So historians were actually skeptical of accounts describing the size of those monster ships until 1962, when workers on the Yangtze riverfront found a buried post 11 meters long beside a huge rudder. And it was the right size to have been able to steer a ship of 165 to 183 meters in length. And it was the right age. It was radiocarbon dated to 600 years old to be from one of Zheng He's ships. His 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433 reportedly took him to many parts of Africa and Asia. He visited what are now Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, India, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Yemen, Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania. And some scholars even speculate that he traveled as far as North America and Australia. His huge ships were so state-of-the-art for their time that they ensured that he only needed to engage in combat when threatened. And this permitted him to engage with other nations by reciprocal win-win diplomacy. In fact, Imperial China's military activities, unlike Europe's, were virtually all defensive, protecting China's territory from external threats, not initiating attacks beyond its borders. After the death of the Yongle Emperor in 1424, who was the champion of Zheng He, the voyages suddenly stopped. The Ming Dynasty ended in 1644 and was followed by the last imperial dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. In the book, we explore the fall of this dynasty and China's century of humiliation and the short-lived Republic of China under Sun Yat-sen, and we touch upon the legacy of 2 leaders, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, whose philosophical battles are still being fought today from the great beyond. I discuss the founding of the People's Republic on October 1, 1949, and shortly after when Chairman Mao said that the Chinese people had stood up. I discuss Mao's well-intentioned but ideologically bound efforts to jumpstart a country and its economy that had reduced China to what everyone called the sick man, now we'd say sick person, of Asia. And we look at the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, both resulting in chaos and countless deaths and suffering of hundreds of millions of people. The book discusses one of the most beloved Chinese leaders, China's first premier, Zhou Enlai, who's here with Sukarno of Indonesia. Who's the other guy? Nasser. Okay. And we look at Chiang Kai-shek's almost successful assassination attempt on Zhou that was worthy of a James Bond novel. We examine Zhou's idea of folk diplomacy, a parallel track to the formal world of ambassadors and diplomacy. I discuss how Mao's death on September 9th, 1976, was believed by some superstitious Chinese to have been foretold by a national disaster of a massive magnitude 8 earthquake near Beijing 6 weeks before. Mao had said that Stalin was 70% good and 30% bad. And the same formula has been applied to Mao after his passing. But in the book, I discuss a different formulation put forward by an American man here I knew. His name was Sidney Rittenberg. And he worked with Mao and his compatriots, but was jailed by them because he pissed off Mao and Mao's wife. And Joseph Stalin said he was an American spy. Now, another famous Westerner in Chinese history, Anna Louise Strong, also was said by Stalin to be a spy, but for whatever reason, she didn't go to jail, and I can't tell you why. So I also spend time dealing with Chinese leaders after Mao up through Xi Jinping. We explore how and why Deng Xiaoping is the person who lit the fuse of today's China miracle. Deng Xiaoping was nicknamed the Little Cannon because he was only 1.5 meters tall. And we recall what Mao told Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in 1957 in Moscow. See that little man there? He's highly intelligent and has a great future ahead of him. Little did Mao know how much of a future the then already 53-year-old Deng Xiaoping and China would have after Mao's passing, almost 2 decades later. Deng believed in crossing the river by feeling the stones. He and Mao both cited the 2,000-year-old Book of Han, where it said that you seek truth from facts. That was wisdom Deng followed meticulously, but Mao apparently quickly forgot. We look at why pure communism didn't work and why the flexible model of socialism with Chinese characteristics has been such a success. And I look at the kibbutzim in Israel to show why communism didn't and doesn't work in its pure form. And we take a look at the fact that there were no private enterprises in all of China in 1980, only SOEs, not one private business. And we examine the transformation to a mixed public-private economy, including the first private restaurant in China, as well as national champions like Huawei and DeepSeek. The book goes on to discuss red letter days in modern China's history, including Resolution 2758 of 1971, which, despite the futile attempts of the United States to the contrary, expelled Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China and installed the People's Republic of China as the sole representative of the Chinese people. We examine Hong Kong's return to China on July 1, 1997, marking the end to China's more than a century of humiliation. And here's an aside, in China, every foreigner can be a star. In fact, to be in a film or movie or anything in China, you need one thing. Can anybody guess what it is? A pulse, okay? So here's me in the 2014 CCTV documentary series called Deng Xiaoping at History's Crossroads. wherein the British Governor General of Hong Kong tells me, as Prime Minister Callahan, that China would certainly renew the 99-year lease forced at gunpoint on a humiliated China in 1898, because 1990s China still desperately needed advanced British technology. It was shocking to me that the British Foreign Office, after all these decades and centuries of dealing and dueling with China, they still didn't get it, and in fact were clueless about Chinese culture. They should have known that the loss of face inflicted on China by the British in the 19th century was like a festering wound that had stung deeply for a century, and that China would stop at nothing to restore its honor at the earliest opportunity by reclaiming its territory. And we examine Richard Nixon's visit to China in February 1972, that we now know as the week that changed the world, and the little-known protocol-shattering handshake on the tarmac of Beijing Capital International Airport on February 21, 1972, that helped smooth Sino-U.S. negotiations to a successful conclusion, resulting in the Shanghai Communique of February 27, 1972, which, among other things, pledged that both former enemies would work towards the normalization of relations based on the principles of mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, equality and peaceful coexistence. In it, the U.S. acknowledged that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. And China said that all nations, big or small, should be equal. Big nations should not bully the small, and strong nations should not bully the weak. And interestingly, China stated that China will never be a superpower, and it opposes hegemony and power politics of any kind. We examined China's entry into the World Trade Organization on December 11, 2001, the key international organization that regulated global commerce and promoted free trade, at least until Donald Trump crippled it. China's accession to the WTO marked a significant turning point in the country's economic developments and its integration into the global economy. It was at once a testament to China's commitment to reform and opening up, but at the same time was one of the sweetest fruits of its labors. The process of WTO accession began in 1986 when China applied for membership. Negotiations were long and difficult, with China facing significant opposition from some WTO members, particularly, of course, the United States. The main sticking point included the level of protection for the environment, intellectual property rights, liberalization of China's service sector, and the opening up of China's market to foreign goods and services. China had to make significant changes to its economic policies and legal framework to join the WTO. These changes included reducing tariffs, eliminating non-tariff barriers. China also had to amend hundreds of laws and regulations to bring it in line with WTO rules and regulations, and had to agree to increase scrutiny from the international community, particularly in areas such as IPR and environmental protection. In addition, increased competition from foreign companies put pressure on Chinese firms, but it also forced them to become more efficient and competitive. I talk about how China, often accused of intellectual property theft recently, was one of the earliest victims at the hand of the Byzantine Empire 1,500 years ago. And I later detail how an enterprising young English lad with a photographic memory named Samuel Slater, know anything about him? Oh, okay. Well, he worked in the English mills as a young man with the state-of-the-art weaving machinery of the first industrial revolution. He barely escaped from England to the U.S. in disguise, because if he'd been caught, he would have been killed on the spot. He sold the designs that he memorized in New England and became known as the father of the American Industrial Revolution. The English, though, know him by a slightly different name, Slater, the traitor. We go on to discuss how Deng Xiaoping, who was responsible for China's meteoric rise, lived long enough to witness many of the fruits of his labors, but died in February 1997 and didn't see the accession to WTO. We go on to examine China's two centennial goals, first proposed under President Jiang Zemin in September 1997, when they were purely aspirational, and the achievement of the first in 2021 under President Xi Jinping to build a moderately prosperous society in all respects. It's the ancient Chinese goal of building a Shaokang society. It's roughly equivalent to what we consider middle class. And I go on to shed a light on President Xi's Chinese dream of national rejuvenation in his Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I think you know this joke, but a joke circulating around China these days is that Donald Trump is making China great again. But I do avoid, and believe me, it was difficult, very difficult, to keep the focus on China itself rather than external forces buffeting the country and trying to prevent China's rise. We look at China's amazing progress from one of the planet's most economically challenged and polluted countries, complete with the air apocalypse that Yuling and I lived through in Beijing about a decade ago. We examine what China calls their whole process, people's democracy. As you know well, the term democracy comes from Greece and means the people rule. In ancient Greece, that meant only free men, and it excluded slaves, women, and foreigners. That left about 10 to 20% of the population. It was also a direct democracy where the small minority of men eligible to vote themselves debated, discussed, and cast ballots. We look at how, by necessity, today we have representative or Republican democracies, but unless rules are drawn fairly, as we can see as what's going on in some countries these days, the process can quickly deteriorate and break down and either not be reflective of the will of the people or may only reflect the will of some people. So whole process people democracy is China's form of people power that derives from its unique culture, history, and national circumstances. It emphasizes that the act of voting is only one dimension, and participating in the political process and place significant weight on citizen involvement in a multiplicity of channels of governance, such as being consulted and providing input on issues that touch people's lives and thus help maximize the possibility that the interests of a wide variety are well represented in the decision-making process. You know about the Chinese system, and we could debate about that. They say in Washington that money talks and bullshit walks. I don't think it's so much the case in China. China actively does consult with a variety of diverse stakeholders. And I think that they're listened to. And now that we have the internet, more and more people can be more easily consulted. In many countries like mine, the political process, unfortunately, is biased in favor of elites who employ armies of highly paid lobbyists, many of them former government officials who use powerful carrots and sticks to bend executive and legislative officials to their narrow and selfish interests at the expense of the entire population. Since I worked in the Congress and for the Carter administration, I could see how the legislative process was really a lot like a sausage factory, where you don't want to see exactly what ingredients go into the end product. But China has a secret sauce too. China's secret sauce is what's enabled it to do so much things in so many fields: the new quality productive forces, AI, EVs, rare earth, space exploration, and defense. Since 1949, it's the 5-year plan model that's been China's continually improved and refined master compass, charting the country's path in 5-year increments. Rather than coming from on high, 5-year plans are a multi-year bottom-up collaborative process, now including significant online input from Chinese citizens and government officials, academic experts, and other stakeholders who discuss, debate China's near and longer term future to guide the country's development. Governments have many shapes and forms, but the bottom line really is how they promote the welfare of their people above all else. The great Roman Empire statesman and philosopher Cicero was right when he wrote 2,000 years ago. I'm going to ask you to translate it. Salus populi suprema lex esto. Okay, it's okay. It's okay. The welfare of the people is the highest law. In 1944, Chairman Mao said it a different way. He said, Wei Ren Min Fu Wu, serve the people. He was right, of course. When we see too many leaders globally engaging in blatant self-service instead of serving the people, and then we can see the contrast. So I think the bottom line is not what I'm telling you, but what the people themselves say. So a lot of public opinion polls have been done polling Chinese people. So I would just talk about a couple of them. That China's governance model does deliver remarkable results according to the people. It's not what people, the leaders tell their people, it's what the people think themselves. So before, during, and after COVID, unbiased public opinion surveys repeatedly put Chinese citizen satisfaction with their government among the top rankings of countries surveyed. While trust in government has generally plummeted globally after COVID, especially in developed countries, the trust of Chinese people continues to remain in the top level of the rankings. In one of the largest and longest academic surveys in China conducted by a foreign research institution, a long-term study released in 2020 by Harvard's Kennedy School examined the relationship between Chinese citizens and the Communist Party from 2003 to 16. The study found a near universal rise in average satisfaction towards all levels of the Chinese government over this period, based on more than 31,000 respondents in both urban and rural areas. The report states, we find that since the start of the survey in 2003, Chinese citizen satisfaction with government has increased virtually across the board. Now, perhaps you can't believe these findings, and this makes you shift in your chairs, be a little bit uncomfortable. They certainly run counter to the conventional wisdom and perhaps where we get some of our news from. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. It's what happens when your brain tries to process conflicting data and struggles to resolve the conflict. And here's another study which comes from a source, though, that might put your mind slightly more at ease, since the person who founded the NGO, the Alliance of Democracies, who published the data, is former NATO Secretary General and former Danish Prime Minister Anders Rasmussen. Since 2018, they've published this index and called the Democracy Perception Index. And according to the one in 2024, respondents in China have very positive opinions about their own political system. 92% say that democracy is important to them. 91% say that people, rather than just a few, serve the interests of all the people. Even 85% say all people have equal rights before the law, and 79% even say China is democratic. Chinese respondents are more positive than those in the US and most European countries on these points. And Chinese respondents had some of the most positive results globally. Moreover, for a quarter century, Chicago's Edelman Public Relations Company has compiled its Edelman Trust Barometer of how leading countries' own citizens trusted their respective four major institutions: business, government, media, and NGOs to, quote, do what's right. Even despite the recent economic challenges, China was at the top of the table, 80%, in the 2026 edition, which was released just last week, as it was number one or tied for number one in every year since 2018. If you're still suffering from a serious case of cognitive dissonance, though, trying to reconcile what I'm telling you, there's only one cure for your cognitive dissonance, and that is, like some of us, to have gone to China and see for yourself. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer. I have a lot of the data, but it is very, very interesting comparatively and absolutely. I finished the book with some recommendations of places to visit and the splendors of China, such as the otherworldly Guilin or Hebei Province's Chengde, the Qing dynasty's largest surviving imperial garden palace complex, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I point out an amazing, I can show you a couple more, Stefan, look, here's another one, here's another one. Okay, I point out an amazing place, though, that's not an imperial palace or anything that grand, but it's built by an amazing man in Beijing Center. China is much about the promise of its future as it is about its rich past. In one innovative structure, Parkview Green Mall represents stylish and pragmatic innovation, okay, there we are, and its green future as the model of chic, sustainable architecture. It reminds me of what the famous Austrian management guru Peter Drucker once famously said: the best way to predict the future is to create it. So for years, I'd watched this mysterious construction site morph into a massive futuristic building. And it was Parkview Green Mall. And it was completed in 2012. It was planned right down to the fact that it's located in near the Austrian embassy in the capital's district called Fengkaodi, which means green, grassy area. And so they seem to think about everything. It's the first commercial project in China to get the LEED Platinum certification as a fully green building. I was gobsmacked, really, by the level of thoughtfulness and planning, together with its design and art collection. Drucker and Parkview Green's creator, George Wong, were of the same mind, but Wong went Drucker one step further. He created the future by being the leading pro-social property developer of his era, who was already dreaming about an environmentally sound building in the heart of Beijing decades ago, before almost any private citizen or government anywhere was doing anything about saving our endangered planet. George Wong lived long enough to see his dream realized, but he died much too young at age 65. I often saw him in art events and lectures at his Parkview Green, in what's now his enduring monument. Unlike many property developers, he didn't have an edifice complex whose only goal was to put his name on as many buildings as possible. Does it remind you of somebody? I won't ask you who. George Wong had a passion for sustainability, and he wanted to help save the planet by showing others exactly how to do it. For example, Parkview Green turns what could have been a huge glass solar oven in summer and a refrigerator in winter into an energy-efficient paradise. In part, it does it by taking advantage of natural ventilation without complicated technology that's prone to break down under stress. For example, the large interior space, 89 meters high at the top of the pyramid, by employing basic physics, acts as a solar chimney, sucking up warm air and out of the building. And instead of over-reliance on energy-hungry air conditioning and heating in a hermetically sealed space, this wonderland that Wong called his fairy tale is also ventilated through underground ducts using naturally consistent geothermal conditions. Parkview's innovative design results in a 44% energy saving. Even wastewater from the sinks is treated on site and reused for landscaping. And so I could also tell you that he designed Parkview so it did not take one ray of sunshine from the neighborhood. And if you ever go there, it's really a veritable museum of 500 works of art from George Wong's collection of Western and Chinese masters. And as I did, you could spend hours there relaxing and being inspired. In conclusion, please remember utopia only exists in our dreams, and that all countries are a mixture of good, bad, and ugly in varying proportions at any given time. But that China is alone in having rescued almost 1 billion people from extreme poverty, a feat unequaled in world history. But don't believe me. Don't believe the sinologists in the room completely, but they know what they're talking about. You have to go see for yourself. And so I'm going to close with what Jeffrey Sachs wrote in the foreword to my book. Now, Jeffrey Sachs and I are from the same suburb of Detroit, but I never knew him before 2.5 years ago, and we met at the Diplomatic Academy when he was there, not speaking, but seeing his former student who'd been the foreign minister of, where was that? I can't remember. Serbia, yeah, Serbia. So what Jeff said was, when Harvey tells you that in this book, with which I concur based on my own observations and studies, is that China's successes were the results of decades of hard work, high saving rates, good governance, skillful planning, and remarkable entrepreneurship. Anybody who thinks that China's economic success is flimsy or somehow unearned has not understood or seen it close up. The Chinese people have worked hard round the clock, year after year, to achieve remarkable economic success. So don't believe Jeff or me or a sinologist or anybody else, because you have to go and see for yourself if China is 1.4 billion dreaming dragons or meddlesome mandarins. Thank you very much.
My question is, well, it comes back to this century of what humiliation, as it's called, and Britain obviously probably holds first place as the bad boy there, but they weren't alone. There were other powers that were taking advantage of China and grabbing its territory. In particular, there's one, Russia, which probably even grabbed more territory in terms of square kilometers, and is still holding on to it. Yet, from what I read in the English language or German language press, I never hear a peep mentioned about this. Is there any discussion about this humiliation suffered at the hands of the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th, early 20th century in China? If not, is there perhaps is there a motive for why it's not being discussed? And perhaps do Chinese amongst themselves say, we got to settle this score and get that territory back too at some point in time?
Well, all I can say from my perspective as a political scientist is that Chinese people have a very long perspective. And so today is today and tomorrow is tomorrow, and tomorrow may be very different from today. But I'm not aware of any discussion of that topic at the moment.
You've spoke of how China in the last decades has raised hundreds of millions out of poverty. Are you familiar with the Gini coefficient and the distribution of wealth?
Yeah.
How does China measure up with other countries in this respect? Is this wealth relatively evenly distributed, or has it become like the U.S. where 1 or 2% own something like 50% of the national wealth or national income?
It used to be in China, when I talked about the time there were only state-owned enterprises, no private businesses, that Gini coefficient, there was almost complete equality. Everybody had very fond memories of that time, but they also have a memory of being extremely poor. So everybody was equally extremely poor. But today, of course, it is more like America, and maybe Europe is even better than US, and I think it's better than China in terms of the distribution. One of the problems is, I think I said at the beginning, so long ago, I think I said that there's a big difference between the urban and rural divide. And so the rural areas that used to be the engine of China's economy in the good old days is kind of left behind, and they have worse social benefits, unequal social benefits, and still their conditions are being improved. But it's one of the major challenges for the government. And so they continue to work on that, and they admit that that is the biggest, one of their biggest problems, is to try to promote the equality between the countryside and urban area. Now, Chairman Mao, because he came from a farm background, he was big on people power, human energy. But now with high tech, what's very interesting actually about China, not only the urban divide and the rural divide, is China's, I didn't have a chance to get into it, but China's population by the end of the century is going to be half of what it is now. So that means about maybe 600 or 700 million people. And the question is, how is that small population going to support the government, social programs, and so on? And what the government now is looking into are things like how to tax robots for value added. And I think it's a realistic thing that they have to look at, actually, because there will be less people. And I know I asked an expert from University College London a few months ago about this, and he said, well, people have so much more leisure time that they'll be having time to paint and to go hiking. But I don't think you can paint and go hiking, 8 hours or 10 hours a day. You have to have some meaningful purpose. And I talked about the fact that I discussed Israeli kibbutzim. And the reason that they failed was that the Marxian idea, which they follow, of each according to his ability, each according to his need. So the iron rice bowl, so you just put your hand out, you got your meal ticket punched or whatever. Now, that didn't work. And that was the greatness, I think, of Deng Xiaoping, that he recognized human nature, that people wanted to achieve, and they wanted to prosper by that achievement.
I agree with all your points, so there was hard for me to find any question, but you also said it now in the last thing, the demographic development. To survive as a nation, you have to reproduce, you have to support your population. China now made some changes which are a little bit alien to Western audience. Maybe, for example, they prohibited 2 female men in television. And they also now, it's quite recently, maybe a week old or a 2 week old, they banned all beauty filters for YouTube, for their, what's the Chinese version of YouTube, or? TikTok, not TikTok, that's a different one. WeChat. Yeah, WeChat or the channels, yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you see any development that China tries to change the way how the interaction between male and female works in order to get a higher reproduction rate?
That's a good question that I haven't thought about.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know what they...
But it seems to be to go a little bit in that direction.
I think what they're thinking about more these days is the fact that the population is getting much older. And so and they're also thinking about increasing consumption. And they need to increase consumption in order to get the economy moving more strongly. And so one of the things they're concentrating on now is the silver economy or the silver gold mine. And that is something that really could be mined. But in terms of the genders, I think it's better than it used to be, because Chinese society has a history of femicide, killing babies, female babies and things like that. And I think there's a real prejudice. Even Chairman Mao said that women hold up half the sky, but they didn't and they don't. And I hope that they will. But women are still not equal. You can look at the composition of the government and so on, or businesses. Some progress has been made, but not enough. That's as much as I can say, unless you guys have some comment about it.
Harvey, I don't know if you had the time to discuss this, but was it Jeff? Yes, Jeff. Jeff's point was actually quite good in the sense that he pointed out this contradiction between the unequal development in the rural areas and urban areas. But have you discussed in your book at all the idea of the principal contradiction that the Chinese government actually bases all of its decision-making upon, which is a fundamental Marxist perspective that they bring to the international political discourse? So they have recognized this inequality, and they say the contradiction isn't between the rural and urban development, but the actual principal contradiction is the inequality versus the will to have an ever-improving life. So even the urban population, they still want their lives to steadily improve. And so this is the actual contradiction, how to balance the wish of the urban population to improve with the inequality of the rural populations. Have you discussed it?
Yeah, I do discuss it, and I discuss this Hegelian, these principal contradictions, and that's part of the ideology, and we're coming up for a new one quite soon, because it's going to be interesting to see. But I think it will have something to do with technology, with quality of life, and with where China is going to be in the 100th birthday. And so I think they're constantly trying to balance these things. Where they're going to come out, I don't know. But I do know that the next 5-year plan is due to come out, and there's hints about the 5-year plan, and it's going to involve a lot more technology. It's going to involve a lot more of technology that will give people opportunity, will free people up, but also free them to buy more things as well. And I do think the Chinese government, it may not have been so in imperial times or in Maoist times, but I think the government is fine-tuned in order to try to satisfy people's wishes as much as possible. And of course, everybody pokes holes, finger at China for human rights policies and things like that. And the difference stems, the principal contradiction there is the difference between Eastern and Western society. So Eastern society being a Confucian society where you value the whole of society, whereas here in the West, liberty, equality, fraternity, etc., that kind of thing. And so why the people, like the EU parliamentarians, get concerned about some of China's policies. It just depends how you look at the world. That's why I said in my book, and why I told you that no country is perfect, and all mix of good, bad, and ugly in various proportions over periods of time.
My understanding to China's economic growth is really rapidly growing, really high. But I think that USA or most part of Africa has more understanding to China's economic growth or development growth as compared to Europe regions. And there's more of a focus on the negative aspect of China's development than the positive side of it. Why or what do you think this is the reason to this effect, and at what point would Europe have more lineage towards the positive side of China's economic growth as regard to the negative side of it?
Thanks. I think it goes, and what country are you from originally?
From Ghana.
Ghana. I think it goes back to the questions I raised early on about why people in the West are upset about some of the Chinese government's policies. And I think it's a combination of those. But what I do have to say is I think that President Trump and American policies as emphasized in the national security strategy, the so-called Donroe Doctrine, with a focus on Western Hemisphere. And by the way, I don't think Donroe Doctrine refers to Donald Trump. It refers to mafia dons, because that's the model that Trump learned from his mentor, Roy Cohn, who was an excellent lawyer but a terrible person. And so I think that Europe now has an opportunity, hopefully it'll take it, the same way that Canada seems to be grabbing it, to become more engaged with China out of economic necessity. So I think Europe has a chance now to cooperate, and like I cited the article early in my talk about how one anti-China person thinks U.S. should cooperate with China on EVs the way Canada does. And it's also the same reason President Trump became livid at Prime Minister Mark Carney for making the deal on EVs with China, that there's a same opportunity for Europe if they can seek it. And also, it may be an opportunity for a long frozen policy, a comprehensive agreement on investments between Europe and China to be finally enacted. And I think that could make a difference. So I think if Europe is pragmatic, we'll see some changes. If it continues to not be pragmatic, it's their choice. But I think they have an opportunity now that it could be wasted if they don't act on it. That's my view.
One more?
Yes, please. It's not the topic of yours, Harvey, but maybe someone else can answer to this question. The percentage of the world religions in China, and what about the tolerance? So how are they tolerant to people believing this or that?
Well, I would say that the Chinese government monitors carefully any organized groups, whether it's religion or anything else, because the Communist Party believes it's doing a good job and wants to stay in power. So with regard to religion, it depends. There are state-recognized churches and others. The state-recognized churches are not so much of a concern, but others might be. But I also know that the Chinese government has had an on and off again dialogue with the Vatican about relations with the Catholic Church, and it's a seesaw relationship. Sometimes they make progress, sometimes they don't. I guess I could only say it's complicated.
If I may just add from a historian's point of view, in the 19th century, there was the Taiping Rebellion, found, and roughly, depending on which figures you choose to believe or not to believe, somewhere between 10 million to 40 million people died during this Taiping Rebellion, which was caused by a person who proclaimed he was the reincarnation or the younger brother of Jesus Christ. So religion has had some impact on China in a very, very significant way, and can't blame them for being careful sometimes. You can be overly careful, but so last question for today.
Thank you for letting me get 2 pitches in here. The demographic crisis, which I don't know if China sees it as a crisis, but I know in the rest of the world when your population is in demographic decline, it's seen as a crisis. Is this already impacted China to the point where they're having to bring in workers from abroad? If yes, how many are coming in? And 2, is there a bit of a xenophobic reaction on this, and where are these workers coming from, or where will they come from, and what kind of job roles will they fulfill? Normally, in developed economies, it's at the lower socioeconomic level.
It's a good question, Jeff, and I don't think it has. And I don't think it has an easy answer. Yeah. I mean, look, Japan has been going through this for decades, and they haven't been able to answer it yet. And there still seems to be a bias against foreigners in Japan. And in in China, I'd say that there's some of the same factors are at play. And I think the Chinese government would still like to have more of self-reliance on its own people. And I think that you could look at this demographic crisis as, although it's not really true, but they say that the Chinese characters for crisis is danger and opportunity. But it really is that dichotomy, because look, if you have half the population, that's half the population you need to service. But it's also half the population who aren't contributing financially or whatever, and that's where the robots and taxing robots and stuff comes in. They're all interesting questions. So I think we should all be happy that we're not Chinese government officials, most of whom work very, very hard, because I think they face some questions that have no obvious answers. It's not like when we took multiple choice exams and could find the one answer that was right. Now it's much more complicated than that.